Okay, today we have a very interesting presentation about the Chosin Reservoir Retreat from Hell. I, being a former Marine, I wasn't there, of course, I wasn't even in the service at that point in time, but it's in Marine history as one of the greatest incidents in Marine history of all time. It's the longest retreat the Marines ever had, okay? It was an intelligence failure there, particularly by MacArthur. However, Irwin Braun will explain the details. Let me describe Irwin Braun. He served in the Korean War as an infantry intelligence sergeant. He graduated from City College, or we know as CCNY. Was president of his own advertising agency and handled accounts like Sony Corporation of America, authored a book and many articles on professional advertising, consultant to the Federal Trade Commission on healthcare advertising. Irwin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I'd like to ask a question. How many of you heard of the Chosin Reservoir? About a third of you. Well, if you were alive in 1950 and you read the newspapers, you certainly heard about it at that time. But to get the rest of the story about the Chosin Reservoir, you have to go back to 1945. In that momentous year, World War II ended. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. With the capitulation of the Japanese Empire, Korea was now free. The Japanese had occupied Korea in 1910, and they were brutal rulers for over 35 years. The United States landed troops in South Korea, while the Soviet Union marched troops into North Korea. An arbitrary dividing line was set up to separate the two armies, and that arbitrary dividing line was a place called the 38th parallel, right here. So the Soviets marched in here, the Americans landed at Incheon, and we took control of the South. Korea was placed in the United Nations trusteeship with an election to take place in 1948. The election never happened. The Soviets would not allow election in North Korea because they knew that the Democratic Party of Syngman Rhee, who was a nationalist, would win. So there was no election, and there was an election in South Korea, and Syngman Rhee elected as the first president of South Korea. The Soviets brought into North Korea a Moscow-trained Korean named Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung. And he's the grandfather of the current leader, Kim Jong-il. And the United States helped and equipped the new Republic of Korean Army, but they gave them enough weapons to control the population, not enough weapons to stop an invasion. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, established a modern army in North Korea with the latest weapons, including the T-34 tank. That was the tank that was instrumental in defeating the Nazis in World War II. They also had MiG fighter planes that the Russians gave them to support the infantry. In June of 1950, Kim Il-sung went to Moscow to see Joseph Stalin. And he told Stalin that if he invaded South Korea, the war would be over in 3 days. Stalin told Kim that he had to get the approval of the Chinese. Stalin knew that if the North Koreans got into trouble and needed help, the Chinese would have to bail them out. With a green light from Stalin and Mao Zedong, Kim launched his invasion of South Korea on June 25, 1950. It was Sunday, and President Harry Truman was in Independence, Missouri, with his family when he heard the news. He thought it was the beginning of World War III. He flew to Washington immediately and called a cabinet meeting. Truman and his cabinet agreed that we had to save South Korea, and he ordered the Air Force into action. The North Korean army moved rapidly. They captured Seoul very quickly. And Seoul, they landed, they came through here where the red lines are. They captured Seoul immediately. South Korean resistance was very limited. Okay. The North Korean army moved to Seoul. General Douglas MacArthur was in command of the Far East Army, and after a tour of the battlefront, he requested American combat forces to stop the North Korean army. Now the American army at this time was a mere shadow of its former self. In 5 years, the army had gone from 11 million men in uniform to a handful of divisions, about 150,000 men. We were totally unprepared for war. And the troops in the army were mainly occupation troops in Japan, who were unprepared for combat. The first troops to land in Korea were called Task Force Smith, after the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Brad Smith, and they attempted to stop the North Korean army. They were about a battalion. A battalion is 1,000 men. They sent to stop an army. North Korean tanks, the T-34 tanks and infantry, drove through the American positions with very little effort. The Americans could not stop the tanks, so the battle at Suwon, which is south of Seoul, turned into a rout. The North Koreans were driving for the port city of Pusan, which is down here. They were driving down here. The Americans could offer very little resistance to the North Korean army and continued to retreat. Finally, at the Naktung River, the United Nations Army set up its defenses to halt the North Koreans. The area we call the Pusan perimeter, that's the yellow area on the map. And the 6 weeks in the summer of 1950, the United Nations Army fought valiantly. The North Koreans attacked the beleaguered United Nations Army, but they were unsuccessful in driving the Allies into the sea. In September of 1950, General MacArthur launched his masterstroke at Incheon Harbor, the last great sea, air, land operation in American military history. He landed right here, Incheon, just 30 miles from Seoul. It was a stunning victory. The American landing barges came ashore at Incheon quickly, captured the city, and captured Seoul. On September 16th, there was a breakout from the Pusan perimeter by American and South Korean forces. They drove north rapidly to as the North Korean army started to disintegrate as a fighting force. As the United Nations approached the 38th parallel, the decision was made to carry the fight north and destroy the communists. However, the army was not to engage in any action near the Manchuria-Russian border. That's up there near China. In the midst of all this, China warned the United States not to cross the 38th parallel, to stay away from the North Korean border. The warning was ignored. Mao Zedong, China's leader, was getting anxious about American troops near China's border, so he called for Chinese volunteers to resist American imperialism. The United Nations Army was divided into two forces. Advancing in the northwest was the 8th Army, and they captured the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, and continued to drive north to the Yellow River. The river separated North Korea from China. And pushing north on the east or the 10th Corps. They had landed at Hungnam a week earlier. And that's where the 10th Corps was pulled out of here, sailed around, and landed at Hungnam, right here in North Korea. When they landed, who do you think greeted them? Bob Hope was on the shore to greet the landing barges. Okay. When the North Korean army in full retreat, and offering no resistance to the United Nations, President Truman summoned MacArthur to a meeting on Wake Island in the Pacific Ocean. At that meeting, MacArthur assured Truman that the formal resistance will end through North and South Korea by Thanksgiving. When asked about the Chinese chances of Chinese intervention, MacArthur replied, "Very little. If the Chinese try to get down to Pyongyang, there would be a great slaughter." Famous last words. On the eastern side of Korea, the 10th Corps, landing at Wonsan Harbor and Hungnam, was delayed because mines had to be removed from the harbor. It's over here, Hungnam. The 1st Marine Division was ordered to proceed northwest to seize 4 hydroelectric plants along the Chosin Reservoir. The 7th Division, which is part of the 10th Corps, proceeded north with the Marines, and the unit reached the Yellow River, the border between North Korea and China. On October 15, 1950, 150,000 experienced Chinese combat troops crossed the bridges in North Korea undetected and went into hiding in the mountainous terrain. The CIA failed to detect the thousands of Chinese troops hiding in North Korea. However, we managed to capture a few Chinese soldiers, and they told about thousands of troops entering North Korea. By the end of October, it was obvious the Chinese were in North Korea in force. A few firefights broke out between the Americans and Chinese, but they were inconclusive. Meanwhile, General MacArthur and other generals ignored intelligence reports about a large Chinese presence in North Korea. They also continued to promise to bring the troops home by Christmas. Then the Chinese army disappeared. The top brass at the 8th Army assumed that the United Nations had won a major victory. They also thought the Chinese army had retreated into Manchuria. The Chinese chief of staff told the Indian ambassador, Sardar Panikar, that China would not allow Americans to come to the border with Manchuria. The first unit to be attacked by the Chinese were the South Koreans. When the ROKs saw the T-34 tanks, they threw their weapons away and retreated south. The 2.5-inch rocket launchers fired from bazookas were unable to stop the Russian tanks. In fact, the shells bounced off the tanks. It was not until later, when we employed a 3.5-inch rocket launcher, that we were able to stop those tanks. With the Chinese human wave attacks, blowing bugles, whistles, and banging gongs, the South Korean army was terrified and in a disorganized retreat. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, the 10th Corps continued to move north. The Corps was composed of the 1st Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division. And in full disclosure, that's the unit I served with. The road from Hamhung on the East Coast was 78 miles of narrow dirt road through some very rugged hills and mountains. Okay, this is where they landed at Hungnam on the Sea of Japan on the east coast of Korea. They were headed north towards the Chosin Reservoir. On that dirt road, if you look at the photographs, you see how narrow that road was. that they had to go through the mountains. The road from Hong Kong on the coast was 78 miles of narrow dirt road through some very rugged hills and mountains. The units moved very slowly through the mountains and were stretched out so thin they could not support one another if attacked. On November 25th, the Chinese launched an attack on the 8th Army, and it looked like a rout. In addition, the 8th Army and the 10th Corps were separated by an 80-mile gap in Central and North Korea. So they had, both sides there was a huge gap in the central part of the front. Chinese usually, incidentally, no word of the 8th Army retreat on the west coast reached the 10th Corps on the east coast. The 8th Army never communicated their situation with the 10th Corps, leaving the flank unprotected. The Americans thought, mistakenly, that this Chinese attack was the last-ditch effort in the war. However, a captured Chinese prisoner was brought into headquarters of General Walton Walker. Walker assumed the Chinese lived in Korea. Would you believe that? He assumed the Chinese lived in Korea. He said, after all, a lot of Mexicans live in Texas. He was a two-star general, three-star general. General MacArthur's headquarters was totally unconcerned about the Chinese in North Korea. General Willoughby, MacArthur's intelligence officer, said the time for China to intervene had passed. It was too late to save the North Koreans. We'll be home by Christmas. The weather also became a factor. The 90-degree heat of summer changed dramatically. Frozen blasts of air came sweeping down from Siberia, so cold that it froze the United Nations troops. The weather had changed before the troops were issued their cold weather gear. They were wearing fatigues and field jackets. Much later, the troops would finally be issued their parkas, boots, and gloves. At Unsan, the Chinese wanted to send a message to the United Nations troops. While some GIs built fires to keep warm, the Chinese, moving very quickly at night under full moon, were able to exploit the weakness of the United Nations troops. Some of the GIs were actually bayoneted in their sleep. As the trucks moved over roads through a rice paddy, the roadway was blocked with an artillery towing truck, overturned. The convoy was halted and nothing could move the Chinese. The Chinese, seeing the blockage, unleashed mortar and artillery attacks on the halted convoy. On November 2nd, the 1st Cavalry Division, after enduring many attacks by the Chinese, was ordered to retreat. The horrific attacks inflicted many casualties on the United Nations troops. American prisoners had started to see these attackers were Chinese. One POW said, "For God's sake," he said to a Chinese, "it's not your war." "It is now," said the leader of the Chinese assault force. The Chinese continued attack for 10 days when their supplies began to run low, and they withdrew from the battlefield and completely disappeared. On the Eastern Front, Marines did not expect an easy walk to the Yellow River. They knew they'd have to fight. North of Hunan, the Chinese attacked the rocks first. Marines came to the rescue and killed 700 Chinese troops in front of them. Chinese withdrew and went into hiding again, just as they did on the West Coast. That was a favorite tactic of theirs. General MacArthur, who insisted the Chinese would not enter the war, was furious. He accused China of committing one of the most offensive acts of international lawlessness by moving without notice. Did MacArthur really expect the Chinese to notify him that they were intervening in the Korean War? Did he expect them to send a telegram? He ordered the bridges to be bombed on the Yellow River. That's the border of North Korea and China. And the Joint Chiefs countermanded the order. They feared the bombing would escalate the war. MacArthur wired the Joint Chiefs. Men and material in large force are pouring across all bridges over the Yalu from Manchuria. The moment not only jeopardizes but threatens the ultimate destination of the forces under my command, end quote. Caught in a dispute between the Joint Chiefs and MacArthur, Truman sided with MacArthur and lifted the restrictions, and MacArthur continued attacking. Bombing began on November 8th. Some of the roads and bridges were destroyed, but the Yellow River had frozen over, allowing the Chinese to cross at a number of places uninhibited. And they would, the date is also important because the first jet air battle occurred in military history on November 8th. An F-80 shot down a MiG-15 fighter plane, probably piloted by a Soviet flyer. The modern jet air war had begun. On November 15th, General Walton Walker, acting on the orders of General MacArthur, launched a final advance on the Yellow River. His army was short on ammunition, winter clothes, and rations. On the Eastern Front, the 10th Corps, the Marines leading, were ordered to advance inland and capture 4 hydroelectric plants along the Chosin Reservoir. From there they advanced to the Yellow River. So the Marines landed at Hunan, and they would walk up, go up to here. Here's the Chosin Reservoir. It was 56 miles up to this point. And then it was up here, they would advance up here around Chosin Reservoir. It was a 78-mile march through some of the most rugged mountains in the world. The path was a narrow dirt road that could barely accommodate a Sherman tank. The Marines and Army advanced and were strung out over 85 miles of roadway. They would pass through many hamlets and towns like Coterie before they arrived at the southernmost point of the Chosin Reservoir, a hamlet called Hagaruri, and that's the one over here. General Nicholas Ruffner wrote later, "It was an insane plan. You couldn't take a picnic lunch in peacetime and go over that terrain in November and December. It was so brutally cold." Marine Commander General Oliver Smith was dubious about the whole plan. He didn't want his men scattered along a flimsy dirt road, and he wanted reliable supply depots. So he stalled. On October 26th, the Marines moved northwest into the mountains. They pushed 42 miles where the train goes from a flat plateau to a winding, narrow roadway through hills and mountains. They had reached the mountain hamlet of Hagaruri at the base of the Chosin Reservoir. There were two roads at this point. The road on the east side of the reservoir was assigned to the 7th Infantry Division. The Marines would advance on the west side of the Chosin Reservoir, moving north. In his infinite wisdom, General Smith would build airstrips on the frozen ground at Coterie and Hagaruri. It would prove to be a lifesaver a few days later when the wounded had to be evacuated. The brutal cold winter weather descended on the troops, and they looked at the thermometer as it plunged to 30 degrees below zero. The cold numbed fingers and toes. It froze the motor oil in trucks and jeeps. The M1 rifles and machine guns would not fire and malfunction. And the men were desperate. On November 27th, the 10th Corps offensive began. General Edward Armand flew in and told the troops, "The enemy who is delaying you is nothing more than remnants of Chinese divisions fleeing north. We're still attacking and going all the way north. Don't let a bunch of Chinese laundrymen stop you." A day later, General MacArthur ordered Armand to withdraw the 10th Corps back to the beaches, and the army was told to withdraw from the Yellow River. The typical GI wore a field jacket with a liner and a summer-weight fatigues, a pilot cap, gloves, and a helmet. They were totally unprepared for the winter. For the food, the troops survived on ice-cold sea rations. There was no hot food for the dog faces. The Chinese, on the other hand, wore padded jackets, soft caps, sneakers, no gloves, no helmets, no boots. While the United Nations Army was moving north, the Chinese troops by the thousands were in place in North Korea waiting to attack. Chinese movement to North Korea is now regarded as one of the most secretive troop deployments in military history. They march at night with no artillery, trucks, or tanks. They use mountain trails, not roads, to carry everything they needed on their backs. 80 rounds of ammunition, foot rags, a week's ration of rice and fish, and they hid in the daytime in the mountains under nets, camouflage nets. As the Chinese poured into North Korea, no one, politician or military, came forward to confront MacArthur. After all, it had been his decision to cross the 38th parallel and advance north to the Yellow River. President Truman, as Commander-in-Chief, accepted full responsibility for the decision. By this time, China had deployed 300,000 men in North Korea, while the United Nations Army had 250,000 troops. There were also 100,000 North Korean troops in North Korea. The troops at the Chosin Reservoir found they had advanced into a trap. They were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese troops, and the brutal weather was also a factor. The howl of the wind was so fierce that it drowned out the Chinese bugles and burp guns. On the east side of the river, the reservoir, the Chinese attacked the army troops designated as Task Force Faith, after the commanding officer, Colonel Don Faith. The Americans fought as they retreated south to Hagururi. That's over here. This is the point where they got up here, 7th Division. The 1st Marines got up to Yodamni, but they would all be eventually retreating south. Colonel Faith was desperate, and he asked for help from the Marines. Colonel Faith received a radio message from General Smith, quote, "Unable to assist you, you're on your own," end quote. Good luck. On November 27th, Marine Army units headed southeast, but the Chinese firing down on the roads from the hills and mountains offered fierce resistance. The GIs eventually reached the village of Udamni, a few flimsy huts surrounded by high ridges. Human waves of Chinese attacked the Marines, blowing bugles and whistles. They attempted to cut off the Marines by attacking south, but the Marines beat them back. On the eastern shore of the Chosin, Colonel Don Faith's 32nd Infantry found themselves surrounded. As I mentioned, they retreated and suffered 600 casualties. The surviving troops fought their ways to safety by crossing the frozen Chosin Reservoir and heading south for 2 days. The battered battalion fought their way to Hagururi. Of the 2,500 men who participated in Task Force Faith on the east shore of the Chosin, only 1,000 made it back. Colonel Faith was killed in the retreat, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The survivor of the Chinese attack said the communists machine gunned them when they attempted to surrender. They burned wounded American prisoners alive and danced around them like wild Indians. They also threw prisoners on the road and rode over them with crooks. They bayoneted others in the face. The wounded GIs poured into Hagururi and were flown to army hospitals in Japan. As the Marines retreated from the Chosin Reservoir, General Almond told the Marines, "Don't worry about your equipment. Once you get back, we'll replace it all." But General Smith of the Marines told him, "This is the equipment we fought with, and this is the equipment We're going to bring back every Jeep, truck, tracked vehicle, and tank. They also brought back their wounded and dead. They were stacked like cordwood on the trucks and Jeeps. As Marine and Army units moved south, the Chinese held long stretches of the road, and they stuck to their tactics of firing on the troops from the high ground. The Marines had fought for every inch of ground, had to fight for every inch of ground, and some compared it to Iwo Jima. When these dauntless, dirty, bearded fighters marched in the village of Hagoruri, that's on the southern tip of the Chosin Reservoir, they closed ranks, and with their heavy boots beating cadence, marched in on the frozen ground. Army troops, seeing the Marines, took off their helmets and cheered the Marines. The Marines took 1,500 casualties at Hagoruri. There were so many killed, they laid them out on straw and covered them in tarpaulin. At 30 degrees below zero, blood froze on wounds. Plasma was useless because it froze in the tubes. The only way you could tell the dead from the living was if the eyes moved. General Smith admonished the war correspondents to using the word retreat. He said, "We are not retreating. We are merely attacking in another direction." Quote. Contributing to the Marine breakout from the Chosin Reservoir was every available land-based fighter in Korea and Japan. In addition, bombers and fighters on 7 aircraft carriers attacked the Chinese relentlessly. On December 6th, Marine and Army units assembled and once again started to move south. Tanks led the way while infantry climbed the hills and ridges to provide security on either side. But the Chinese fired on the convoy with mortars and machine guns. By 10 o'clock that night, they had traveled 4.5 miles into a place called Hellfire Valley. Chinese prepared an ambush that stalled the convoy for 2 hours. Tanks finally cleared their way, blasting the Chinese machine gun nests. Marine Corsair fighter planes provided vital air support, bombing Chinese positions. 30 yards in front of the Marines, the Chinese kept attacking and took tremendous casualties. By December 7th, no Marines were left in Hagoruri except for demolition teams. By midnight, there were no Marines there. The entire operation took 38 excruciating hours. But 9,000 Marines, 800 soldiers, 125 British commandos, and 40 South Korean police had marched with 1,000 vehicles a step closer to survival. Inside the Hagoruri perimeter, Marines in the 7th Division, that's Hagoruri is over here, they had marched down here. So now they were moving south. Inside the Hagoruri perimeter, the Marines and the 7th Division troops joined up with the troops already there, bringing the total force to 14,000 men. They now had to regroup for the final push to the sea. The next base they would march to was at Chinhongmi, 10 miles to the south. On December 8th, the long column retreating into a Chinese roadblock about 1.5 miles south. Chinese launched an attack using tanks and drove the Chinese away. The Americans launched an attack using tanks and drove the Chinese away. On December 9th, David Douglas Duncan, the great Life magazine photographer, whose photos are in the back of the room, saw a Marine struggling in the brutal cold, trying to open a sea ration. And Duncan asked him, "If I were God and I could give you anything you asked for, what would it be?" And the beleaguered Marine replied, "Give me tomorrow." All that mattered was one more day. In addition to the hills surrounding the roads, there was an apron bridge that spanned a 1,500-foot deep gorge about 3.5 miles south of the slow-moving column. The Chinese blew a 16-foot gap in the bridge. The Army engineers came up with a solution that had never been done before. The Army dropped a new bridge using parachutes from a flying boxcar. 8 sections of a treadway bridge were attached to the largest parachutes in the world and dropped from 800 feet. While 2 sections landed in Chinese hands, the other 6 sections were enough to do the job. The work was completed in 2 days. The crossing of the bridge of trucks, tanks, and jeeps was an unnerving job because there was only an inch of clearance on the width over the bridge. So crossing the treadway bridge was really a hair-raising experience. However, they all made it across. As the long convoy moved south, they approached the Funshan Pass. Chinese moving on the hills occupied the high ground surrounding the pass. The Marines once again launched an attack with the help of Corsair fighter planes and drove the Chinese off. Following the convoy through the mountains were over 100,000 North Koreans hoping to get out of the country. They were desperate. These were civilians. And they risked everything to be evacuated with the Americans. The last troops and vehicles reached Chim-Hung-ri on December 11th. And the 3rd Infantry Division guarded an assembly area where the entire convoy could be protected. They now leave the last secure assembly point to ride to Hungnam on the east coast of North Korea. Marines and soldiers climbed onto anything moving, tanks, trucks, jeeps. Of the 25,000 troops in Chosin campaign, 6,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. At least 6,000 suffered from frostbite. 718 Marines were killed, 192 missing in action, and 3,500 wounded. In comparison to the bloodiest battle of World War II at Tarawa, the Marines lost only 985 and had 2,000 casualties. You can see that the Chosin Reservoir was one of the most brutal battles in Marine Corps history. There was no frostbite also in the Pacific. President Truman awarded the Marines and the 31st Infantry Regiment veteran of the 7th Division the Presidential Unit Citation. It read, "The 1st Marine Division, reinforced, emerged from its ordeal as a fighting unit with its wounded and with its guns and equipment, and with its prisoners, decisively defeating 7 enemy divisions together with elements of 3 others." That's end quote. While history records Chosin campaign as a defeat, like Dunkirk, Anzio, and Bataan, to the survivors, it was a triumph. They had fought and marched their way out of hell and survived. And according to Marine records, 25,000 Chinese troops were killed and 12,500 wounded. About 30,000 Chinese suffered from frostbite. At Hungnam, the Marines and Army troops were loaded on ships, sailed away south for Busan. It was the day before Christmas, December 24th, 1950, 67 years ago, this month. Next month, a great Christmas present. In addition to the American troops evacuated, 91,000 suffering North Korean civilians were also allowed to board the ships and leave. They expected to be killed or imprisoned by the Chinese and North Koreans. The ships also carried 350,000 tons of stores and equipment and 17,000 vehicles. Tons of dynamite and other explosives would be used by the demolition teams to destroy the city of Hungnam on the coast, the Sea of Japan. And the promise made by MacArthur and others for home by Christmas would be another example of the failed leadership that endured during the entire Korean War. Thank you. Anybody have any comments or something? Yes, Mark.
MacArthur wanted to use nuclear bombs.
Right.
He actually, those bombs were moved to Okinawa. Truman vetoed it, and that's when it came up that MacArthur got fired.
MacArthur got fired because he contacted Joe Martin, and
That was there, but behind the scene.
Yeah.
He insisted upon using these.
Oh yeah, he wanted to widen the war. He wanted to
Right.
go into China.
Right, and that was,
Truman wanted to limit the war just to North Korea.
right.
And MacArthur, you know, he should actually, MacArthur, in his long career, should have been court-martialed twice. Twice. Once in the Philippines during World War II, when after Pearl Harbor was bombed, he was in the Philippines. He was the commanding general, and they left all the airplanes on the runways in the Philippines. The next day, the Japanese came back after Pearl Harbor and destroyed the entire Air Force in the Philippines.
Right.
All the planes were on the ground. MacArthur left them there. He should have been court-martialed for that. And in Korea, he should have been court-martialed for what happened in Korea also. He was, what did Eisenhower say about MacArthur? He studied dramatics under General Douglas MacArthur. He was a great he loved to act. He was a great actor. Yeah, Barbara.
Where was Pork Chop Hill, or did it even exist?
Yeah, I was on Pork Chop Hill.
Where is it? What
Pork Chop Hill was
country
set on the
is
front right. It was, I'll show you. Okay. Okay, Pork Chop Hill was right here, approximately the central part of the front line. It was in the front of the 7th Infantry Division, and I was on Pork Chop Hill when we took it, and there was a story about me in the newspaper, and when I was ordered up there. I was a combat artist, and I was ordered there to sketch the Chinese positions, and that was how I got into Pork Chop Hill. There was a book also I met in Korea. I met a man named S.L.A. Marshall. S.L.A. Marshall wrote a book called Pork Chop Hill.
That's what I'm...
Yeah, and he asked me to do a drawing of the front line, and I did it, and it's in the book. If you ever see the book,
Did you
Pork
do
Chop
those
Hill.
drawings?
Pardon?
Did you do those drawings?
Yes. I was an artist. Yeah, Sydney is a Korean veteran, served in Korea.
When I came over there in 1952, they heard that I was coming and they stopped the war.
Okay, heard Sydney was coming, they put in the van.
The reason why it became a United Nations war was because at the Security Council, the Russians didn't show up, and
Yes.
they couldn't veto
Right,
the
absolutely,
United.
that's true. I didn't want to go into all those details, but it's absolutely true.
Not
The
a
Russians
detail.
could have vetoed the United Nations Army, but the United States still would have gone in. You know, the 95% of the troops were American.
Yes.
A very small number of United Nations troops. By the way, I served with the Ethiopians. You know, the Ethiopians supplied a battalion, and they were attached to my regiment. These were Haile Selassie's imperial bodyguard, and they were great fighters, and there were like 15 other countries supplied combat troops. Yes,
I was with the Turks,
you were
and
the
they
Turks.
were very vicious fighters.
They were great. Turks had a terrific reputation.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
China itself, why didn't they veto the?
China wasn't a member of the United Nations at that time.
Wasn't a member at that time?
No.
Okay, also, again, MacArthur, the Battle of Leningrad, when the Russians lost hundreds of thousands of people in that cold weather, did he realize that the same kind of battle that they're having there?
Pardon?
Remember, the Battle of Leningrad, the
Yeah,
Germans
Leningrad.
lost, they didn't have the uniforms either, it was so cold, wasn't it?
Yeah.
During the winter, and the same thing happened here in Cham, at the Allen River.
Well, the Germans didn't have their winter uniforms either.
Yeah, I'm saying, well, did he realize what was going on? They went Martha knowing that the weather was
Well,
30 below zero. How could he
they
fight?
lost the whole army at Leningrad, the Germans, 200,000 men.
Yeah, well, same thing with the Chinese.
Yes.
Question. Having served in the Air Force as a dentist, I lost that war. I still get cavities. I'm curious, because I don't remember, the size, comparative size of a division, an army, and a corps.
Well, a division is about 15,000 men. A company, the lowest lowest contingent is a squad. Squad is 10 men. Then there's a platoon, that's 40 men. Then there's a company, that's, you have 4 platoons. And then you got 4 companies make a battalion. And 4 battalions make a regiment. and like 3 or 4 regiments make a division. And then 3 or 4 divisions make a corps. And then 3 or 4 corps make an army. Okay, that's the whole breakdown.
A lot of it was lost because they didn't have intelligence to know what was going on with the Chinese, the
Well,
CIA.
the intelligence was almost non-existent. Non-existent, yeah. Well, you know, American intelligence, first of all, the CIA, that intelligence is Army intelligence, an oxymoron. No, they made so many mistakes. It was incredible. And the leadership, as I said at the end, was horrendous in the Korean War. I mean, really, let me finish what I'm saying. They decided the last couple of years of the Korean War, they were going to put in field-grade officers like colonels as head of regiments who never saw combat. And these were guys who served in supply and things like that, like Eisenhower. Eisenhower never saw one day of combat. You know that, don't you? You know that? I saw more combat than Eisenhower. So, yeah, so they moved colonels. And the last colonel we had, he never saw a day of combat. He was drunk most of the time. And Colonel Van Way, and he's mentioned in the book Pork Chop Hill. And he was totally incompetent. Should have been court-martialed, but they gave him medals, you know, the Bronze Star, Silver Star.
The armistice was signed in '53.
Yes.
Okay. As late as '54, the wounded from Korea were still being sent out to Japan.
Yeah.
I was in Tokyo Army General in '54.
They were evacuating wounded as soon as they...
And the wounded were still coming out of Korea in '54,
It's hard to believe.
'55.
It's hard to believe. It's really hard to believe. You know, it's hard to believe that the wounded were flown out of those bases. They were flying them out. Yes. Well,
You might say the only thing good that might have come out of the Korean War,
we saved South Korea.
South Korea.
47 million people now live in freedom because what we did
Yeah.
65 years ago. You know, that's a big thing. 47 million, as Korea is one of the leading economies in the world today. That's who we'd save.
Yeah, the other thing is that they finally understood the wind chill factor. They used to give you supplies for a temperature of 30 or maybe 20, but they understand with the wind chill factor, they need stuff for 50 below
Oh,
zero.
yeah.
And that's when they finally understood the wind chill factor and started issuing clothes equal to both the wind chill factor, not just the temperature.
Yeah, they finally started to get winter gear, and when I was there in 1952, we got special boots
Yeah,
and
they
parkas.
started understanding.
Yeah, but we were totally unprepared, yes,
When the Chinese entered in 1970, I believe, is that?
1950,
Were they?
1950.
1950. Did they have Russian rifles? What rifles?
They had Russian equipment. They had burp guns. They had Russian weapons. They had the big fighter plane. The Chinese did not have an air force. The North Koreans had an air force. But the Chinese used all Russian equipment. And They were very good, you know, we totally underestimated them. Totally underestimated. It was a lot of racism. We just, you know, this remark about laundrymen, you know, it was just a racist remark, like another egghead, another moron, General Almond, who really was responsible for the disaster and the retreat. So that was really, yes.
Are you defending our position to be in South Korea or Korea?
Now,
46 million Koreans are now free. How many American troops died for no reason?
37,000 American troops.
37,000 American troops died. For what?
For saving the South Korea.
From what?
From what? From a communist takeover.
Really?
Yes.
Weren't you paying attention?
I was paying attention. But we're still worrying about them right now.
Yes, because we didn't destroy the communists. They're still there. They're stronger than ever.
You said at the very beginning, when the war was over, North Korea took over North Korea, and the Americans were in South Korea. Am I correct?
Yeah, right. This is the dividing line.
Right, that was a dividing line.
Line, the 38th
Right,
parallel.
okay. What were the Americans doing there in the first place?
Now you're getting political,
Okay,
you're talking about the
what are we
war.
doing there?
I'm sorry, it is political.
Korea was occupied by the Japanese for 35 years.
Yeah.
We came in, it was decided at Yalta that the Soviets would come in from the north and the Americans would take the south. It was decided at the Yalta Conference. The 38th parallel was the line arbitrarily chosen as the dividing
No,
line.
I understand. It's political.
By the way, this is a very interesting story. One of the colonels who was involved in deciding where to draw the line was a guy named Dean Rusk. Okay, he was working in Washington D.C. and they said, well, you know, the Soviets want to move into Korea. They said, where's Korea? So they had to send down to the National Geographic Society to get some maps. They got the maps. They said, this is a very nice line. That's the place we're dividing it. That's the story of how the line was chosen. Yes.
Oh, I was just curious. We were in South Korea last year.
Okay.
And when you talk about...
Well, tell the people what has happened in South Korea.
What is happening?
When I was there, it was totally destroyed.
It is so beautiful.
It's one of the most modern.
It is so modern, and I hate to say the buildings. Maybe countries should go to war, because after you go to war, you are rebuilt in such a I mean, I'm being facetious, but you're just being built.
What was your question?
My question is, we went up to this mountain where you look down, there was a line that you couldn't go past. And I just wanted to know, was that the 38th parallel where we looked down onto North Korea?
Yeah,
you could not go past that?
It was the DMZ. It was the DMZ.
Okay, so that's where I was at the DMZ.
You were at the DMZ.
Okay, also I want to just mention to the story, there was an American who was taking pictures, and you are told, there are signs everywhere, do not go past this red line.
Did you hear the story that was on the news the last few days? About the North Korean soldier who defected?
Yeah.
And he ran, was shot 4 times. I don't know if he survived. Did he survive? I don't know.
Yes, he did.
It shows you how desperate they are to get out of there.
But anyways, I just wanted to say that there was an American, he wanted to take more photographs. And there are signs all over, do not pass this red line, do not go over the red line.
You don't want to go there. You don't want to go
Well,
there.
this gentleman decided, he was standing next to us, he was going to go over the red line. He really wanted to see what he called North Korea. Just as he went over, out of nowhere, 2 guards came on either arm, and they smashed his camera.
Oh, really?
They just smashed it, And I don't know where they took the gentleman, but they just dragged him out of there to someplace, nobody knew what he was. But when they say, do not cross that red line, don't.
I mean it.
They mean it. Oh.
Yeah. Anybody, any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, with your feelings about the leadership and whatever, was MacArthur right about taking the war north at the time? Do you feel that if he had gotten the green light, would he have won this? And a better way for the president?
If they stayed in the 38th
No.
Wanted to bomb the
MacArthur
bridges.
wanted to take the war north into
China?
the source of.
Do you think that anybody could beat China? They had
Like
a billion people. China could take a loss of 500 million people. That's what Mao Zedong played. So let them drop an atomic bomb. Let them kill 5 million people. We still got over 1 billion people. You know?
It's
So,
like Russia.
Yes,
You
Barbara.
can't win a war with Russia.
Pardon?
In a sense, you can't win a war with Russia.
Oh,
It
Russia?
keeps it like Napoleon.
Oh, nobody has ever,
But the,
yeah, right, yes.
I saw a presentation on one of the stations about how cultist the North Koreans are, that Kim Jong-un can do no wrong. They're starving, they have no health care, they have nothing, and they are grateful to their wonderful leader for everything that they have. And it's unbelievable because they have nothing.
The population of North Korea is about 22 million, something like that. They were starving in the 1990s. There were several million people through starvation. The country is really, since the Soviet Union disintegrated, the Soviet Union used to keep them alive. Now they're on their own. And it's pretty tough for them. It's to me that they're building missiles, and the people are really suffering. The people are really suffering. How do they get away with it? Because there are about 1 million or 2 million people, people in the army and the leaders, who live very well. They live well, they have food, they have clothing, they live well in Pyongyang, and they're the ones who control the country. The other people want to get the hell out of there.
But if they say, if they have.
A lot of them try to go and sneak into China, but China will return them. Yes?
I must see the same program that you did, and they said, well, we're Americans, and they were flabbergasted, and they said, America is starvation, you have no liberties, and they have such bad propaganda, they have no idea what America is. And
Well,
however we talk about them, they're talking about us 5 times.
Well, first of all, in North Korea, it is so controlled. The media is so controlled. I only have one TV station.
Yeah.
The radio, everything is so controlled. People don't know what's going on. But there are people who do know. News gets in through China on the northern part of North Korea. They do get information. They know that things are better elsewhere. And a lot of them have, defected.
But not the general person.
Pardon?
Not the regular person, only very few. The percentage.
Yeah.
Because they went to different villages, and they were amazed that you're an American, and how terrible you are.
Well,
I mean, I'm just saying, what we say about them, they're telling about us 10 folds worse.
yeah. I just want to tell you a story about, remember I mentioned the civilians who marched behind the troops to get out of North Korea? One of them was a guy who became a doctor, a cardiologist. He told his parents, he was in North Korea, he told his parents, I'll be back in 3 days. He wrote a book called The 3-Day Promise. He was evacuated in the northern part here of over here at north part of Korea, near Humnan. He was one of the civilians. He made his way to America, became a cardiologist, and he was the biggest contributor, donated $400,000 to the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. I don't know if you all know that. And he was so grateful to the Americans and the Korean veterans who saved him. But he never got back to Korea to see his mother. Yeah, it was, you know, they're very family-minded, the Koreans. And to him it was a tragedy. He never saw his mother again. Sydney.
Assuming we followed some people's advice and we did not go into, and the North Koreans took over the entire peninsula, what would have happened?
Well, now instead of 20 million North Koreans who are anti-American, and you would have 70 million, and it would be a huge
Threat.
huge threat. Now it's still a threat, but then now it would be a huge threat, and it would really threaten Japan.
Yes.
Really threaten.
In retrospect, is there any place where they felt that MacArthur should have stopped and then they were able to control rather than going further north?
No, they felt they should have stopped.
Other than the 38 parallel,
Yeah.
any part of the north they should have stopped.
Yeah.
Like a Pusan or Hungarian, they stopped there
Yeah.
and controlled it.
Well, the reason that the front line bends is because the mountains. The mountains, you occupy mountains, not lines. Okay.
Irwin.
Yes, Barbara.
MASH was very popular. It was reputed to be completely unrealistic, and
Yeah.
it played to the drama and the comedy. What was your impression of MASH as it related
First of
to
all,
the
MASH was not
actual
about the
thing?
Korean War.
Hmm?
It was not about the Korean War.
No,
It was about
not,
Vietnam.
But it was in, and
No,
it
it was
was
supposed
located
to,
in South
supposed to
Korea.
take place in South
Was it
Korea,
in
but it wasn't
South
the Korean
Korea?
War. No, it wasn't.
Or North Korea?
It was totally, first of all, the movie was pretty good, but the thing on television was not. Okay, Sydney.
There were MASH hospitals in
Oh,
Korea.
yeah, sure, I was in a hospital. I was in a MASH hospital for a week.
What happened to you?
Pardon?
What happened to you?
I was suffering from, I guess, battle fatigue. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.